Whether you think that Age of Sigmar is a tactical game or not, the one aspect of the game that pretty much everyone can agree is tactical is the alternating activation in close combat. It's quite simple to get your head round. If you have a unit that's about to be wiped out, for instance, you probably want to attack with that early in the sequence so that they actually get to do something before they're wiped. If you have a monster up against you, maybe you want to do a couple of wounds on it before it strikes to knock it down to the next power threshold so it's not quite so potent. So that's all relatively simple, but what people haven't really been discussing is whether you should even be in close combat in the first place and how many units you should be looking to get engaged in combat in each turn. So I'm going to go into a little bit of that and hopefully inspire people to start looking at the game in a slightly different way and maybe get some crazy ideas flowing around in those brains of yours. Now here's the premise. On a battlefield, a lot of the time you'll have several different potential combats that you might want to become engaged in. So there are a few things you have to consider. We're going to be looking mainly at combats that are just between two units opposing each other, rather than multi-combats. That does complicate the issue. So just to keep it simple for now, we're going to concentrate on just one-on-one unit combat. So the main thing to consider, on your turn, you're going to choose which unit activates first in close combat. So if you think about it, to get the maximum advantage possible out of that, you want to create an odd number of combats. So if there are 3 one-on-one combats going on, like for example the units we've got here on the table, if they were all matched up with each other one-on-one, you would pick a unit to go first, then your opponent would pick one, and then you would pick the third one. So in theory, you should have the advantage in 2 of those combats and they have the advantage in 1. Obviously for the player whose turn it isn't, you would want to try and engineer a situation where you have an even number of combats, so that your opponent is only gaining the advantage in 50% of the combat. That's the basic premise of this. So we've got a little situation here where I've charged my hammerers into these dire wolves. Now these units are just examples, don't worry too much about how these units would actually match up against each other in the game. Let's just assume that all these units are relatively potent and capable of taking each other out. Also, let's just assume that they're not really this close together. This is just so I can fit them all on the camera relatively closely. Let's assume they're too far away to consider doing any multi-charges. So, it's my turn, I've charged the hammerers in. Now I'm thinking, this Slayer, a little bit too far away to attempt to charge. Do I want to charge my Iron Breakers into those Black Knights? This is a dilemma, because I'm going to be activating the first unit in the close combat phase. So, I could go first with my hammerers, possibly wipe out the wolves. But if I charge the Iron Breakers into the Knights, that means that the Knights would be able to go first on me. Or if I went first with the Iron Breakers, that means the wolves would be able to go first on the hammerers. So, we have a dilemma here. Because of course, if I don't charge with the Iron Breakers, I'll leave myself in a prime position to be charged by the Black Knights. You need a little bit of foresight when you're thinking about this whole situation, because it's your turn right now. You've created an odd number of combats here, so that is the ideal. That's the situation you want to be in. There's only one combat, you're going to have the advantage in it. But it's going to be your opponent's turn next. So, depending on your confidence levels, do you think you're going to wipe out their unit with your unit? Because you're going to want to position your troops so that there will be an even number of combats, most likely in the enemy turn, to minimise their advantage. So, if you're not confident at all that you're going to wipe out the wolves, there's one combat for a start in the next turn. With the Iron Breakers positioned there, that would be 2, which is perfect for the enemy turn. That's what you want an even number. So this Slayer here, rather than advancing towards the Crypt Horrors, he could maybe just shuffle back a bit just to make sure that there isn't going to be a third combat where the opponent would have the advantage in the next turn. Of course, remember that we're assuming they're further away than this, because with this exact setup I'm sure those 2 units would just multi-charge the Iron Breakers. So let's assume that's not the case. However, if you're incredibly confident that your hammerers are going to take down those dire wolves, then that's going to change the way you look at it, because in the enemy's turn, you've got one combat probably here, because they're going to charge you most likely. Then, you would think, well maybe I should be moving up this Slayer. Maybe I should be running it as close as possible towards the enemy, kind of baiting him into a charge, because that way, we're assuming this combat's over and done with, and then there'd most likely be a combat between these two and a combat between these two if he goes for both those charges. So you've given him the opportunity to create an even number of combats on his turn, which is what he doesn't want to be doing. Now let's assume that the Slayer is actually very, very close to the Crypt Horrors, and you want to charge with all your units at once. So you've gone in with the Iron Breakers over there, you've gone in with the Hammerers there, and then the Slayer goes in as well. You've now created 3 close combats. You're going to have the advantage in 2 of them, most likely, unless your opponent does something really silly and attacks with a unit that's just been attacked, even though it's no longer under threat. So very likely you're going to have the advantage in 2 out of 3 of these combats. So you can see the basic idea of what I'm getting at here. Looking at the number of combats and how many of them you're going to be going first in is quite key to establishing control of the battlefield in Age of Sigmar. Of course, there are certain situations where you'll have a lot of units that are just much stronger than the enemy units they could potentially fight, so you don't really have to worry about how many of them are getting in there because they're not under threat from the enemy, in which case you just charge them all in and not be too concerned that a lot of them are going to be going first. Also, if you have a lot of units that are just terrible and you really don't want to be in combat with the enemy, then of course delaying the charge until their turn is going to mean that the enemy spend less time in close combat with you. If you feel that your unit is so weak that it's going to get wiped out as soon as it gets into combat with the enemy, regardless of who goes first, then you're probably better off forcing them to kill you on their turn, because that way you'll be able to do counter charges, whereas if they kill you on your turn, they're then free to mow into whatever other units you may have around. When multi-charges come into effect, obviously you can apply the same principles, but rather than just number of combats, you want to be looking at the number of units involved in those combats on each side, and obviously weighing up how many of them are in each individual combat, because you're going to be activating on a unit-by-unit basis. So there's a lot to consider in those situations. Also, the ability to flee from combat could be very important if you want to create a certain number of units in the fight. Really, there's just a lot more in this game for you to be thinking about than meets the eye. It's not just a case of pile in all your models into the fight and then start thinking tactically about which one to attack with first. You really have to be thinking about that before you start moving and deciding exactly how many units you want in the fight per turn. Planning a couple of turns ahead if you can, so that you can minimise the advantage the opponent will be able to gain in their turn. Of course, it's difficult to control the number of combats that are going to be taking place in the opponent's turn because, of course, they can always flee out of fights. So you have to be very clever if you want to be able to set that up. Of course, you can prevent units from fleeing if you surround them utterly and prevent them getting far enough away to be out of combat. And then you can always bait the enemy by just parking fairly close to them, to the point where they kind of forget tactics for a minute and just get a bit of bloodlust and go straight in there for the kill. Well, hopefully I've spread a little bit of enlightenment through the internet. Let me know what you think. If you've got any ideas, drop them in the comments, and I'll see you next time.